Okay, we're going to start diving into some of the social issues involved in planning. And this is just the idea that there's different types of planning we talked about, there's different styles of planners. But there's all these, there's humans that live in these cities that we're planning, right? So there's all these different layers of social issues that should be addressed if you're going to be involved in urban planning. I think it would be unethical to not have an understanding of different social issues and how planning decisions can affect different people. All right, let's jump in. So the learning objectives for this lesson, and it'll take probably 2 or 3 videos to get through it all, is we're going to look at the problems involved in planning for housing, talk a little bit about housing policy. We're going to look at private communities, special case of private, maybe even gated communities, and the issue of homelessness. We will discuss the social impact of other planning issues like disaster planning, environmental justice, gender, feminism. The things that are contained in this video, this presentation, are not going to cover all social issues. It's just some of them, and there's definitely more that we can talk about in class and that we can explore through your class projects. And then we're going to kind of look at who is a social planner. If the last set of lessons looked at different styles of planning, we'll talk a little bit about more about social planners. So let's talk about the roots of social planning. I love to give you a little bit of urban history when I can to kind of put things into context. So the profession of planning, it stemmed from architecture. So early planning was concerned with physical design, the buildings, the roads, the architecture, and really didn't address social issues. It's like when we looked at the plan of Chicago, that was listed as one thing that was kind of missing from the plan is not really confronting social issues. So in the 1960s and 70s, planners, they really begin to talk about themselves as social planners and talk about how social planning was a legitimate subfield within the greater umbrella of urban planning. So 1960s, 1970s America, think about it. I mean, you had the civil rights movement going on, and this really focused attention on issues of justice and fairness. So it just seems appropriate and natural, I don't know what the right word is, that this kind of the focus, the attention on justice, the attention on fairness, this definitely trickled into the field of urban planning as well. So another kind of item is the Vietnam War. This split America and kind of the way they thought about their government. It was almost like this idea, it's like, well, if the government's wrong about their involvement in Vietnam, the government can be wrong about what they're doing here at home, what they're doing domestically. And so part of this was questioning something like a government produced urban plan and start kind of questioning that. So when we talked about the style of planners as a neutral civil servant, someone that's not political, planners didn't want to be. They didn't want to be these neutral servants if it meant that what they had to do was do the bidding of the establishment when they didn't approve of the goals and policies that the government they were functioning within was trying to hand down. So if they didn't agree with goals and policies, they didn't want to just be some kind of neutral person. So, another big thing was this idea that well planned physical projects just didn't work out well. Urban renewal projects had a lot of social consequences. Public housing projects like the Pruitt-Igoe, I mean, that building as a physical project won awards. It won like architecture awards, but it did not work out. It was a disaster. We can talk more about Pruitt-Igoe if you guys aren't familiar with it. And so kind of like these well-intentioned, really good architecture projects didn't work out well. So you had to start putting in this question of social justice. Okay, so let's talk about the case of housing. I know these are crazy looking little arrows, but it's almost like housing kind of spirals out of control. So let's just talk about it a little bit. Many regard housing policy as one of America's most pressing social problems. Housing's a problem, big policy area. Nowhere has enough affordable housing. But let's kind of like go through the flow of it. Is that land use controls, how you're going to use land, decisions about capital facilities. Think of that as like big projects that cost a lot of money. Things like water and sewer lines, they affect how these type of controls affect how much housing and what type of housing can be built in a certain area. So when you've got these mechanisms that affect the price of housing and the type of housing, that decision affects house prices and rent prices and how expensive they are and how affordable they are, and because of that it determines who can live there. You live where you can afford to live. And so you keep kind of going down the flow, and where you could afford to live, where a person lives, this determines where you go to school. Um, Ignore the charter school system for a minute, but normally you go to school where you live in your school district. So this controls what kind of schools you can go to, your access to recreation, the social services, employment, your access to jobs with employment. City services are not the same really in all areas if you look at it. So where you live determines all these other life factors, right? Okay, so policies, keep going down our little flowchart here. Policies that separate housing that low income workers can afford from the jobs in which they are qualified produces unemployment. So if there's this disconnect here. Like if the only place you can afford to live is really far away from the jobs, this is going to increase unemployment. Um, that word, I know it says employment on your screen, it should say unemployment. So unemployment can lead to all these other social problems, right, that our social workers, my psychology friends, and all our other kind of social science colleagues can talk about. But it can lead to family breakup, welfare dependency, alcohol, crime, kind of like all, like I said, the spirals out of control. So all these other kind of issues that can be linked to unemployment. See how like we went down this list and we linked it, all these problems are the result of housing decisions, land use controls that affect housing. Okay, so let's just do an example. Here's your scenario. You've got land use controls in a suburban town where the only kind of permit you can get, they only permit the building of single family houses on half-acre lots or larger. No apartments, no multifamily stuff, only single family houses, only on these kind of big lots. So what this means is this is going to be an expensive type of house to live in and to buy. So think about this. The children who grew up in this house, they're not going to be able to afford to live in that neighborhood when they're young adults. It's not a starter home. They're just not going to be able to afford to live where their parents lived. So they've got to move. A couple that lives in this type of community, they get divorced. And so one of the partners can't afford to live there anymore. They have to move. Let's say you're a couple, you have a child, mentally disabled, mentally handicapped. They're a grown adult now. And you can't find a group home to live in because the town doesn't permit these old single family homes to be converted into group living spaces. Um, so think about that. So just the last kind of scenario, think about it, is a couple can't build a mother-in-law apartment on their property, or like an accessory apartment. So this means because of the way the land use controls, the way the permitting for the houses is that you can't build like an extra apartment, like a little mother-in-law kind of apartment in your backyard. You can't build these additional kind of living structures. You can't turn your house into like half of it's for you, half of it's for your mother, like your mother-in-law, the aging parent or something. So that's just an example of how a land use control with housing can affect these different types of people with these different social situations. So, and then think about homelessness. Like you could decide you're an advocacy planner for the homeless. So, if this is let's say like that's your thing, you want to advocate for the homeless, this is your group, this is your passion. So how would you do that? If the issue in the world that you care about is homelessness, within the field of urban planning, how are you going to use urban planning to address that problem? Okay, so one, you're going to become involved in housing policy. This is going to be your specialty area. All planners can take on a specialty area. Your area could be transportation. It could be parks and parkways. Or parks and recreation. So if you're really concerned about homelessness, you're going to choose housing policy as your specialty area. So the overall municipal housing policy, this affects the entire housing stock. Okay, all the houses, expensive ones, all of them that are in a community. So that includes the low cost end of housing. Now, the availability of affordable housing, of low, like inexpensive rental properties, that availability is directly related to homelessness. So you have so that's one way, is that the whole housing stock, okay, is like pertains to homelessness. And we can talk through this more if it's not making sense in the slides. We can talk through it in class. So you have different stakeholders. You've got homeless, you've got homeowners, you've got business owners. So you're kind of caught in this political, how planning takes place in a political environment. You're kind of caught in the sense that you've got to balance all these different interests, right? The homeless are going to have different interests. These are your like constituents, your community that you're trying to respond to. And so you've got, they have different interests than say the homeowners. Homeowners and business owners, let's say like the business owners don't want homeless people standing on the street in front of their stores because then it's going to chase away their customers, right? So they have different interests, and you can be sympathetic to all these different interests, and it's hard to balance that. So, and then you've got homeowners that are saying, we have our nice, beautiful, perfect little neighborhood. We don't want low income housing in our neighborhood. It's called this whole not in my backyard mentality. So you've got homeowners coming at you from that mentality. Okay, so you've got all these different interests. So what are you going to do? Like, this seems incompatible. What is the planner going to do? So you might want to advocate policy that doesn't reduce the supply of low cost housing. You can do this through lots of different mechanisms. Zoning is a really popular one. So you could look at the way that your city is zoned, the way your community is zoned. One thing you could do is kind of advocate for more flexible zoning. So more flexible zoning would permit something like building an accessory apartment and mother-in-law apartment on a homeowner's property. It could permit to build an apartment above a store instead of the zone saying, nope, this can only be stores, this can only be businesses. You would kind of flex that zoning and make it so you could build an apartment above a store. Stuff like that. Or like with the case with the group home, you would have a zoning, a more flexible kind of zones that where you could, or housing codes. That's this last point, that would make it easier to build group homes, so that you could have a permit that could turn like a single family home into a multi-family type place. So those are just some ways to, like a scenario, some ways to think through a couple issues, social issues as it relates to housing policy, as it relates to a subsection of planning, of urban planning. And we'll just stop here on this video and go on to several different issues in the next video.